Many of you indicated that you were interested in learning a bit more about transgender individuals, and this really warmed my heart because I think it's such an important topic to cover, and it's one that a lot of people could use more information on. So I wanted to make a special lecture where I cover some topics related to being transgender. Honestly, I could probably make this lecture 5 hours long, but I'm just going to touch on a few topics. Most of the information included in this lecture can be found in the book Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Trans, But Were Afraid to Ask by Bryn Tannehill. I picked up this book at Under the Umbrella, which is a really incredible LGBTQ bookstore in Salt Lake City. So if you're ever in Salt Lake, I highly recommend visiting the store. It's truly incredible and has tons of books. I always try to stop in when I'm there since they have a ton of human sexuality nonfiction books, but they also have fiction, poetry, zines, art from local LGBTQ artists, book clubs, and just so much more. They even have a cart with basic resources for unhoused individuals like dental hygiene products, first aid kits, water. It's just an absolutely incredible place. Anyway, so the author of this book, Bryn, is a transgender woman. She's an activist, she was a naval aviator, and she actually left the reserves to focus on her transition. So this book is just really incredible. She breaks down the research in an easy-to-digest format, and it's a great book to read if you really want to understand some of the basic issues related to transgender individuals. This book was published in 2019, so some of the data is likely a bit outdated, but it's still relevant. Most of the topics that I've picked for this lecture are a bit controversial, but they're very important to talk about. Many of you will go on to work with kiddos, whether that's in the medical field, as an educator, or some other field. So one hot topic related to transgender individuals is what to do about gender nonconforming children. So let's go over some of the myths related to these kiddos. Myth number 1. Children are too young to know these things or make these decisions. The truth here is that the psychological community has widely come to the consensus that gender identity is formed by the age of 2 or 3. Additionally, the medical community has shown that sexual dimorphism of the brain occurs in utero as a result of exposure or lack of exposure to androgens. In other words, gender identity and expression is thought to be determined before a child is even born, but by 2 or 3, they're able to express it. And as far as decision-making goes, children can only socially transition at this point. We'll get into medical transition later. Myth number 2. You are whatever your bits say you are. Actually, neuroscience may say otherwise. We're beginning to find evidence of the effect of sex hormones on brain development. In utero, the reproductive organs develop and differentiate earlier than the brain does. When the brain later develops in ways that typically differentiate between male and female, it seems to be based on whether or not the androgens are present and received. Typically, the gonads are already in place and producing minute amounts of hormones. And this differentiation allows the brain development to match that typical pattern. But when something interferes with this process, you can get a mismatch between phenotypes. In transgender individuals, MRI scans have shown that when compared to the brains of cisgender individuals, so individuals whose birth assigned sex matches their gender, transgender individuals show brain structure and patterns of activity more in line with their identified gender rather than their birth assigned sex. So I'm about to say something really important here. A person's sense of self and their gender identity and expression are based on what's between their ears and not by their genitals. Myth number 3. Gender nonconforming behavior and identities are a result of something the parents did. To keep this one brief, the research has not found a link that postnatal social environment, so the home, friends, family, school, etc., has any significant effect on gender identity or sexual orientation. Myth 4. If you made them behave like a proper boy or girl, it would fix the problem. I'm going to tell you about 2 case studies. Trigger warning, suicide. Please move on to the next slide if you're uncomfortable with this topic. So the first case study is about Kirk. Kirk was a child who was put through reparative therapy, as a child in the 1970s. His parents punished him every time he did anything that wasn't stereotypical male. However, this therapy ultimately destroyed him, and he completed suicide when he was 38. David Raymer was raised as a girl after a botched circumcision. A behavioral psychologist named John Money convinced David's parents to have a vaginoplasty performed on him and to raise him as a girl based on the theory that gender was entirely a social construct and entirely a learned behavior in reality and identity. As a teen, David began living as a boy, but also completed suicide. Although these are just case studies, many parents of transgender children have eventually had the revelation that they either had to accept their child or lose them in one form or the other. Myth number 5. My kid said he's an elephant. Does that mean I should put him on an all peanut diet? No, these parents are just being indulgent in a child's fantasy. So just to poke fun at this one, elephants definitely don't live off peanuts. But in all seriousness, being transgender is not a fantasy. It has biological origins. And additionally, many parents fear for the life of their transgender child. Suicidal ideation can be seen even in very young transgender children. So helping them socially transition is one way to help reduce suicidal ideation. Myth number 6. When I was young, I was a tomboy and I didn't turn out to be transgender. So the people who use this argument may have experienced cross-gender behavior, but not persistent cross-gender identity. Masculinity and femininity exist on a spectrum. It's normal for cisgender individuals to have interests that are more stereotypical of the opposite gender. It's worth pointing out that gender identity is how we see our gender, while gender expression is how we express ourselves overlaid with societal stereotypes of gender. So there are key differences between being a tomboy and being a transgender male. This comparison for myth 6 is a pretty terrible analogy. Myth number 7, if you let them socially transition, you're setting them up to be bullied. This is a great example of victim blaming. Instead, we as a society should focus on preventing bullying rather than making the victim conform. The blame for bullying falls on the bully. Institutions that allow bullying to continue after it's been witnessed, and anyone encouraging bullying. Myth 8. They're giving 10-year-old children hormones. Yeah, no, this is false. Puberty blockers are typically the first medication given to transgender children, and these medications are not being given until they're 12 or 13. One of the most commonly prescribed drugs that is used to block puberty is leuprolide. This medication has been used on children who aren't transgender to prevent early onset puberty and has been approved for this purpose by the FDA since 1993. The reasons that doctors prescribe puberty blockers to transgender preteens is that it's much easier to delay puberty than it is to reverse the effects of going through the wrong puberty. Undoing these effects with surgery and hormones can be difficult and expensive. Additionally, leuprolide is reversible. If someone decides not to transition, we can take them off leuprolide, and puberty will proceed as normal. Myth number 9. We don't know what the long-term effects are. So, as I just mentioned, leuprolide has been approved for use in cisgender children since 1983. At this point, this medication has been on the market and has been used for 30 years. So, this argument suggests that we should be having multi-decade clinical trials before we allow people to take certain medications. Well, then we have to figure out how long we should wait until a medication can be prescribed to the general public. Let's say that people want to know what the effects of a medication are 50 years down the line before we begin prescribing it. With this line of thinking, we wouldn't have been able to access ibuprofen until 2022. Myth number 10. What if these kids change their minds? So if a child decides to transition, they typically start by socially transitioning, then getting on puberty blockers, then only after reaching 16 can they begin taking hormones. If a child changes their mind at the social transition stage, then they can transition back socially. And if they decide to stop at the puberty blockers stage, then they can stop taking those and puberty will resume. If at the age of 16, someone is asserting that they are transgender, then it's incredibly unlikely that this will change. Very few individuals whose dysphoria persists past 13 or so decide they wish to stop treatment. Additionally, medical and mental health protocols are designed to only take permanent medical steps after everything possible has been done to ensure that this is the correct course of treatment. Until that point, everything is reversible. A recent study concluded that most of the risks that children who socially transition and their families may experience are based on minority stress in response to unsupportive environments. And myth number 11. These kids should have to wait until they're 18 before doing anything medically, including puberty blocking drugs. What if they regret it later? So it can be very traumatic for someone to go through puberty for a gender that doesn't fit them. Forcing transgender individuals to wait and see can cause irreversible harm. We see evidence of this in the poor mental health outcomes with non-treatment and unsupportive environments. On the other hand, we see much better mental health outcomes associated with early, affirming treatment. Lastly, transition regret is incredibly rare. The last myth we'll cover is myth number 12. You transgender activists want to force all these children down a medical track. No. This is a misrepresentation of what affirmative therapy is. Practitioners of the gender affirmative model don't push children in any direction. Instead, they listen to the children, and with the help of their parents, they translate what the child is communicating about their gender and identity expression. They work towards improving gender health, where a child can live in the gender that feels most authentic to them and can express gender without fear of rejection.